The shimmering heat of the Arizona summer rose like a living thing from the dusty trail as Winifred Fairchild squinted against the glare, the map in her hands fluttering in the hot breeze. She was 3 days behind schedule, her journey from Boston to Fort Worth delayed by one mishap after another. And now her trusty mare Daisy was showing signs of fatigue in the punishing conditions of 1876 frontier country. "Just a few more miles, girl," Winifred murmured, patting the horse's neck as they approached a narrow pass through rocky hills. The landscape around Prescott was beautiful but treacherous, all rust-colored stone and hardy vegetation that seemed to mock her eastern sensibilities. She had left behind a comfortable life, teaching at a ladies' academy, to claim the inheritance her late uncle had left her, a small ranch outside Fort Worth that represented both freedom and a fresh start. The trail narrowed as they climbed, winding around the hillside where the drop-off to her right grew increasingly steep. Winifred kept her eyes forward, trying not to think about the sheer cliff that fell away mere feet from Daisy's hooves. The mare seemed nervous too, ears flicking back and forth as loose stones skittered beneath her feet. "Steady now," Winifred whispered, but her reassurances came too late. A rattlesnake, disturbed by their approach, suddenly slithered across the path. Daisy reared in terror, her front hooves pawing at air as Winifred clung desperately to the saddle horn. For one terrible moment, they teetered on the edge of the trail, and then the ground beneath Daisy's back hooves crumbled away. Winifred's scream pierced the afternoon stillness as horse and rider plunged over the side. By some miracle, she managed to throw herself sideways as they fell, her body slamming against the cliff face while poor Daisy tumbled into the ravine below. Pain exploded through Winifred's right arm as her fingers scrabbled frantically at the rock face, somehow finding purchase on a narrow ledge barely 3 feet wide. For several heartbeats, she simply hung there, gasping, the world spinning around her. When she finally dared to look down, she saw Daisy's broken body on the rocks 30 feet below. Tears stung her eyes. The loyal mare had carried her all the way from the train station in Prescott, and now she was gone. Worse still, Winifred was stranded on a tiny outcropping of rock, her right arm throbbing with what was surely a fracture, the sun beating down mercilessly on her unprotected head. "Help," she called, her voice echoing through the canyon. "Is anyone there? Please help me." Only silence answered, broken occasionally by the mournful cry of a distant hawk. Winifred pressed her back against the cliff face, trying to make herself as small as possible on the narrow ledge. Her canteen was still attached to Daisy's saddle, along with all her supplies. With the sun still high in the sky, dehydration would become a serious concern within hours. She had no idea how long she sat there, alternating between calling for help and conserving her strength. The sun had begun its descent toward the western horizon when she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. Hope surged through her chest. "Hello," she shouted with renewed vigor. "Up here, on the cliff." The hoofbeats slowed, then stopped. For a moment there was silence, and Winifred feared she had imagined the sound. Then a deep voice called up to her. "Madam, you up there?" "Yes." Relief made her voice crack. "My horse fell. I'm stranded on a ledge." A moment later, a broad-shouldered figure appeared at the trail above, silhouetted against the sky. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair that caught the light as he peered down at her predicament. "Looks like you're in a tight spot, madam," he called down, his voice calm and steady. "Name's Victor Mercer. I'm going to get you down from there, so just stay put." "I don't have much choice in the matter, Mr. Mercer," Winifred replied, a hint of hysteria creeping into her voice. Victor's low chuckle floated down to her. "Got some spirit, I see. That's good, you'll need it." He disappeared from view briefly, then called down again. "I'm securing my horse and getting my rope. Just hold tight." Minutes that felt like hours passed before Victor reappeared, this time with a coiled rope over his shoulder and what looked like climbing tools in his belt. He studied the cliff face carefully, then began his descent, finding handholds where Winifred saw nothing but smooth stone. "You from around here?" he asked conversationally as he worked his way down, his movements methodical and confident. "Boston," Winifred replied, watching in amazement as he navigated the treacherous surface. "I'm heading to Fort Worth to claim property from my uncle's estate." "Fort Worth? That's a fair piece from here." Victor paused to test his footing. "What brings you through Prescott territory?" "The southern route flooded," she explained, wincing as a fresh wave of pain shot through her arm. "I was told this pass would be faster than going north." "Whoever told you that did you no favors," Victor said grimly. He was closer now, perhaps 10 feet above her. She could see his face clearly tanned from the sun, with strong features and eyes the color of the Arizona sky. A small scar bisected his left eyebrow, and several days' worth of stubble darkened his jaw. "This trail's barely fit for mountain goats, let alone an eastern lady on her own." Under different circumstances, Winifred might have bristled at his assessment, but her current predicament made argument pointless. "I'm beginning to realize that," she admitted. Victor was directly above her now, studying the ledge where she was perched. "Your arm's injured," he observed. It wasn't a question. "Broken, I think," she confirmed. He nodded. "This complicates things. I can't have you climbing with a broken arm." He thought for a moment, then continued. "I'm going to come down to you, then I'll secure us both to the rope and we'll go up together. My horse Thunder can provide the pulling power." Before Winifred could respond, Victor had swung himself down beside her, landing lightly on the narrow ledge. This close, she could smell the leather of his vest and the clean scent of his skin beneath the dust of the trail. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to dangerous situations. "Miss." He raised an eyebrow. "Fairchild. Winifred Fairchild. Miss Fairchild, I need to examine your arm before we attempt the climb." His hands were gentle as he assessed the injury, but Winifred still gasped at his touch. "Feels like a clean break," he murmured. "We'll need to splint it once we're back on solid ground." He looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers. "This is going to hurt, Miss Fairchild." "I won't lie to you about that." Winifred swallowed hard and nodded. "I understand." Victor worked quickly, fashioning a makeshift sling from his bandana. Then he unwound the rope from his shoulder and began creating an intricate series of knots. "I'm going to tie us together," he explained. "When I give the signal, Thunder will pull us up. All you need to do is hold onto me with your good arm. Can you manage that?" "Yes," Winifred said, trying to sound braver than she felt. Victor's expression softened slightly. "You're doing fine, Miss Fairchild. Many would have fainted dead away in your situation." The compliment warmed her despite the pain and fear. Victor secured the rope around them both, creating a harness that bound them together, her uninjured left side pressed against his chest. He gave 3 sharp whistles, and she heard his horse whinny in response. "Ready?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. Winifred nodded, unable to speak as she gripped his shirt with her good hand. The rope tightened, and suddenly they were being pulled upward, Victor using his boots and free hand to push them away from the cliff face when necessary. The pain in Winifred's arm was excruciating, but she bit her lip to keep from crying out. After what seemed an eternity, Victor's hand grasped the edge of the trail, and with one powerful heave, he pulled them both to safety. Winifred collapsed onto solid ground, trembling with relief and delayed shock. Victor quickly untied the rope and crouched beside her. "You did well," he said, his voice gruff with what might have been admiration. "Let's take care of that arm now." With practiced efficiency, Victor gathered straight branches and used strips torn from his spare shirt to fashion a proper splint. His horse, a magnificent black stallion, stood nearby, watching the proceedings with intelligent eyes. "Thank you," Winifred said when he had finished, the splint immobilizing her arm. "You saved my life, Mr. Mercer." "Victor," he corrected. "And you're welcome, Miss Fairchild." "Winifred, please," she replied. "After what we've just been through, formality seems rather pointless." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Winifred, then." He glanced at the sun, now sinking rapidly toward the horizon. "We've got maybe an hour of daylight left. My cabin's about 3 miles from here. We should head there for the night." Reality crashed back over Winifred like a wave. "My horse. All my belongings." Victor's expression was sympathetic but practical. "I'll come back tomorrow to retrieve what I can, but your mare is beyond help. I'm sorry." Tears welled in Winifred's eyes, but she blinked them back. "Yes, of course, I'm being foolish." "Not foolish," Victor said quietly, "just human." He whistled to Thunder, who trotted over obediently. "Can you ride?" With Victor's help, Winifred managed to mount the stallion. Victor swung up behind her, his solid presence at her back both reassuring and strangely unsettling. She was acutely aware of his arm around her waist, steadying her as Thunder picked his way carefully down the trail. "What brings you to these parts, Victor?" she asked, trying to distract herself from both the pain in her arm and the unfamiliar intimacy of their shared saddle. "I trap and hunt," he replied. "Used to guide for the army when they needed someone who knew the territory. These days I mostly keep to myself." "A mountain man," Winifred said, remembering stories she'd read in the East. Victor's chuckle rumbled against her back. "Something like that, though the mountains proper are farther north. I prefer the high desert." As they rode, Victor pointed out landmarks and named the sparse vegetation that somehow thrived in the harsh landscape. His knowledge was impressive, and Winifred found herself genuinely interested despite her discomfort. The sun was setting in a spectacular display of orange and purple when they reached a small cabin nestled against a rocky outcropping. A corral stood to one side, empty now but ready for Thunder. The cabin itself was simple but solidly built, with a stone chimney and a small covered porch. "It's not much," Victor said as he helped Winifred dismount, "but it's home." Inside, the cabin was surprisingly comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated one wall with a rocking chair and a small table nearby. A narrow bed stood against the opposite wall, covered with what looked like handmade quilts. Everything was neat and organized, not at all what Winifred had expected from a bachelor's dwelling in the wilderness. Victor quickly built a fire while Winifred sat in the rocking chair, exhaustion washing over her in waves. The events of the day seemed almost dreamlike now that she was safe. "I have some dried venison and beans," Victor said, moving to a small cupboard. "Nothing fancy, but it'll keep body and soul together." "That sounds wonderful," Winifred replied honestly. "I haven't eaten since this morning." As Victor prepared a simple meal, Winifred found herself studying him surreptitiously. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years living alone in harsh conditions. Yet there was nothing crude about him. His speech was educated, his manners surprisingly refined for a man who, by his own admission, kept to himself. "You're not what I expected, Victor Mercer," she said without thinking. He glanced up from stirring the beans, one eyebrow raised. "And what did you expect?" Winifred felt herself blush. "I'm not entirely sure. Someone rougher, perhaps, less civilized." To her relief, Victor laughed. "I wasn't born in a cave, Winifred. My father was a professor at the University of Virginia. I grew up with books and proper manners." His expression sobered. The war changed things, changed me. Afterward, I couldn't stomach being around too many people. The war between the states, Winifred murmured. She had been just a child when it ended in 1865, but its shadow still loomed large over the nation. Victor nodded but offered no further details, and Winifred didn't press. She understood that some memories were too painful to share with strangers. They ate in companionable silence, the flickering firelight casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Despite the simplicity of the meal, Winifred found it delicious, the smoky flavor of the venison complementing the hearty beans perfectly. "You'll take the bed," Victor said when they had finished eating. "I'll sleep by the fire." "I couldn't possibly," Winifred began, but Victor cut her off with a raised hand. "My mother would rise from her grave and haunt me if I let an injured lady sleep on the floor," he said firmly. "Besides, I've slept in far worse places than my own hearth." Too tired to argue, Winifred accepted his offer. Victor provided her with a spare shirt to sleep in and turned his back while she changed, a courtesy that touched her. The shirt smelled of pine and leather, indefinably masculine but not unpleasant. As she settled into the narrow bed, Winifred's thoughts turned to her interrupted journey. "I should reach Fort Worth within the week," she said, more to herself than to Victor. He looked up from arranging his bedroll near the fire. "Not with that arm, you won't. The break needs time to heal, at least a few weeks before you should attempt serious travel." "Weeks?" Winifred sat up in alarm. "But my uncle's solicitor is expecting me, and I can't impose on you for so long." Victor's expression was unreadable in the firelight. "We'll ride into Prescott tomorrow. You can send a telegraph to Fort Worth explaining the delay. As for imposing, my cabin's small, but you're welcome to stay until you're well enough to travel safely." The offer was generous, perhaps too generous from a man she had just met. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" she asked. Victor was quiet for so long that Winifred thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "Because 11 years ago, I was wounded in a canyon much like the one where I found you. No one came for me." He looked up, meeting her eyes across the room. "I don't want that to be your story, Winifred Fairchild." The simple honesty of his response silenced any further questions. "Thank you," she said softly. Victor nodded once, then extinguished the lamp, leaving only the firelight to illuminate the cabin. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow will be soon enough to make plans." Despite the pain in her arm and the strangeness of her surroundings, Winifred fell asleep almost immediately, lulled by the crackling fire and the quiet breathing of the man who had saved her life. Morning came with a shaft of sunlight through the cabin's single window, rousing Winifred from a deep sleep. For a moment, she was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings confusing her. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back, along with the throbbing pain in her arm. Victor was already up, tending a small fire in the stove. The aroma of coffee filled the cabin, rich and inviting. He turned when she stirred, offering a brief nod. "Good morning," he said. "How's the arm?" Winifred experimentally flexed her fingers and was rewarded with a fresh jolt of pain. "Still attached," she replied with a grimace. A hint of a smile touched Victor's lips. "That's a start. I've heated water if you'd like to wash up. There's a screen in the corner for privacy." The simple act of washing her face and hands made Winifred feel more human, though managing with one arm was challenging. When she emerged from behind the screen, Victor had laid out a simple breakfast of cornbread and preserves. "We'll head to town after we eat," he said, pouring her a cup of coffee. "I salvaged what I could from your saddlebags this morning." Winifred looked up in surprise. "You went back already," Victor nodded. "Left at first light." "Your mare didn't survive, I'm afraid, but I recovered your bags and a few other items." He gestured to a small pile by the door that Winifred hadn't noticed before. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched her deeply. "Thank you," she said. "Most people wouldn't have bothered." Victor merely shrugged and turned his attention to his breakfast. The ride to Prescott took most of the morning, with Winifred again seated in front of Victor on Thunder's broad back. The town was larger than she had expected, with a bustling main street lined with businesses, a testament to the silver mining operations in the surrounding hills. Their first stop was the doctor's office, where Dr. Samuel Adams confirmed what Victor had already suspected: a clean break that would need several weeks to heal properly. He replaced Victor's makeshift splint with a proper cast, admonishing Winifred to keep the arm immobilized. "Your husband did a fine job with the initial treatment," the doctor commented as he worked. "Oh, he's not Winifred began, but Victor cut her off. "Just doing what needed doing, Doc," he said, his face expressionless. Winifred shot him a curious look, but Victor avoided her gaze, his attention seemingly focused on examining the doctor's collection of medical texts. From the doctor's office, they proceeded to the telegraph office, where Winifred sent a message to her uncle's solicitor explaining the accident and the resulting delay. Then Victor surprised her by leading her to the town's only dressmaker. "You'll need clothes that can accommodate that cast," he explained. "And I reckon you'll want some things of your own, rather than borrowing my shirts for the next few weeks." The dressmaker, Mrs. Holloway, was a brisk, practical woman who quickly understood the situation. She helped Winifred select several ready-made items that could be easily altered to fit over the cast, along with the necessary undergarments and personal items a lady would require. Throughout the process, Victor waited outside, his expression unreadable whenever Winifred caught glimpses of him through the shop window. Their final stop was the general store, where Victor purchased additional supplies, extra food, lamp oil, and other necessities that Winifred realized were required because of her unexpected presence in his home. When she tried to pay for her share, he refused with a shake of his head. "You can settle accounts when you're back on your feet," he said, loading the packages onto Thunder's saddle. The return journey to the cabin was quieter than the morning's ride had been. Winifred, tired from the exertions of the day and the constant ache in her arm, dozed against Victor's chest, lulled by the steady rhythm of Thunder's gait. Victor said little, but his arm remained securely around her waist, keeping her safely in the saddle. The days that followed established a routine of sorts. Each morning, Victor would rise early to tend to his traps and hunt if necessary, returning by midday. Winifred, determined not to be a burden, took over what household tasks she could manage: one-handed simple cooking, keeping the cabin tidy, mending clothes that needed attention. They talked, cautiously at first, then with increasing openness as the days passed. Winifred told him about her teaching career in Boston, her decision to start fresh after the death of her parents, and her hope that the small ranch her uncle had left her might provide the independence she craved. "Most women in your position would be looking for a husband, not a ranching career," Victor observed one evening as they sat on the cabin's small porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Winifred sipped her coffee before answering. "I was engaged once," she said quietly. "To the son of my father's business partner. It was expected." Victor's gaze remained on the horizon. "What happened?" "I discovered that Robert's interest in me extended only to my family's connections and the dowry my father would provide. When I overheard him boasting to a friend about how he would tame the bookish Fairchild girl after the wedding, I returned his ring the next day. Sounds like you had a narrow escape, Victor commented. Winifred smiled faintly. My father didn't see it that way. He was furious, said I had embarrassed the family and would end up a spinster. We barely spoke in the months before he died. The old pain surfaced briefly in her voice. Victor was silent for a long moment. Your father was wrong, he said finally. There's nothing embarrassing about refusing to marry a man who doesn't respect you. The simple statement, delivered without judgment or condescension, warmed Winifred in a way that had nothing to do with the evening air. Thank you for that, she said softly. Victor merely nodded, his profile strong against the darkening sky. In turn, he shared glimpses of his own past his childhood in Virginia. His reluctant enlistment in the Confederate Army at 18, the horror of Gettysburg, where he'd been severely wounded and left for dead. After the war, unable to return to a home that no longer existed and haunted by what he'd seen, he had drifted west, learning the skills necessary for survival from trappers and Native Americans he encountered along the way. How long have you been here? Winifred asked one rainy afternoon as they sat before the fire, Victor whittling what appeared to be a small wooden horse while she attempted to knit with one hand, a challenge that was proving more frustrating than productive. Going on 7 years now, he replied, his knife moving with practiced precision over the wood. Came through with a surveying party and decided I liked the solitude. Don't you get lonely? The question slipped out before Winifred could consider its propriety. Victor's hand stilled momentarily. Sometimes, he admitted, but being around too many people, it brings back memories I'd rather forget. The war, Winifred said, understanding dawning, among other things. His tone discouraged further questions on that particular subject. Winifred respected his reticence, changing the topic to less personal matters. But later, as they prepared for sleep, Victor on his bedroll near the fire, Winifred in his bed, she found herself wondering about the other losses he had alluded to but never directly mentioned. The weeks passed, marked by the gradual healing of Winifred's arm and the subtle shifting of her relationship with Victor. What had begun as gratitude on her part and duty on his evolved into something more complex, a friendship based on mutual respect and growing affection. Victor taught her to identify edible plants in the desert, to read weather patterns in the sky, and to move silently through the underbrush when stalking game. Winifred shared her knowledge of literature and history, reading aloud from the few books in Victor's possession during the long evening hours. They argued occasionally. Victor thought her plans to run the ranch herself were impractical. Winifred found his solitary existence unnecessarily isolating, but the disagreements never lasted long, dissolving into grudging acceptance of each other's viewpoints. It was during one such debate, nearly a month after her accident, that Winifred realized how much her feelings for Victor had deepened. They were discussing her future in Fort Worth, with Victor insisting she would need to hire experienced hands to manage the ranch. You can't possibly run cattle on your own, he said, his tone maddeningly reasonable. It's backbreaking work for men who have been doing it their whole lives. I'm not suggesting I do everything myself, Winifred countered. I fully intend to hire help. But I want to learn the business, not just be a figurehead who lets men make all the decisions. Victor ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of frustration. There's learning the business, and then there's being foolhardy. No one's going to respect a woman who tries to do a man's job. Perhaps respect has to be earned, not automatically granted based on whether one wears trousers or skirts, Winifred retorted, her temper flaring. You of all people should understand wanting independence. Victor's expression softened unexpectedly. I do understand that, he said quietly. More than you know. But independence doesn't have to mean doing everything alone, Winnie. The nickname never used before, and the genuine concern in his voice caught Winifred off guard. She really looked at him, and felt something shift inside her, like a key turning in a lock. The realization that she had fallen in love with this quiet, complex man was as surprising as it was inevitable. "I'm not proposing to be reckless," she said, her voice gentler now. "Just determined." Victor's blue eyes held hers for a long moment. "You are certainly that," he said, the corner of his mouth lifting in a half-smile that made her heart beat faster. The air between them seemed charged suddenly, filled with unspoken possibilities. Victor took a step toward her, then seemed to catch himself, turning abruptly to tend the fire instead. "Your arm should be healed enough for travel in another week or so," he said, his back to her as he unnecessarily rearranged the logs. "We should start preparing for your journey." The change of subject felt deliberate, a retreat to safer ground. Winifred swallowed her disappointment and nodded, though he couldn't see the gesture. Yes, of course. That night, sleep eluded her as she contemplated her situation. In a week, she would leave for Fort Worth to begin the life she had planned. Victor would remain here, in his solitary cabin in the Arizona wilderness. The thought of never seeing him again created an ache in her chest that had nothing to do with her healing arm. But what alternative was there? She could hardly suggest he abandon his life to follow her to Texas. And she had commitments in Fort Worth, her uncle's property, the solicitor who had been holding it in trust, her own dream of independence. Asking Victor to uproot himself for a woman he had known barely a month would be presumptuous at best, foolish at worst. Morning found her tired but resolved to make the most of the time that remained, storing up memories to sustain her after they parted ways. If Victor noticed her slightly forced cheerfulness, he said nothing, matching her mood with his own brand of careful civility. The week passed too quickly. Victor arranged for a stagecoach to transport Winifred from Prescott to the railway station in Flagstaff, where she would catch the train to Fort Worth. He was scrupulously helpful, seeing to every detail of her journey while simultaneously withdrawing emotionally, as if preparing himself for her departure. The night before she was to leave, Winifred found herself unable to sleep, acutely aware that this was her last night in the cabin that had become, unexpectedly, a kind of home. She slipped from the bed and moved quietly to the door, stepping outside to clear her head. The night was cool, the sky ablaze with stars that seemed close enough to touch. Winifred wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders and sat on the small bench Victor had built, her thoughts as vast and tumultuous as the starry expanse above. She didn't hear him approach until he spoke. "Couldn't sleep," Winifred started slightly, then shook her head. "Too much on my mind, I suppose." Victor settled beside her on the bench, leaving a careful space between them. "Having second thoughts about Fort Worth?" "Not exactly." Winifred hesitated, unsure how to express the complicated tangle of emotions she was feeling. "I'm grateful for everything you've done for me, Victor. I don't know how I can ever repay you." "There's nothing to repay," he said simply. "Anyone would have done the same." "That's not true, and you know it," Winifred countered. "You could have gotten me to town and washed your hands of the whole affair. Instead, you've housed me, fed me, taught me." She trailed off, then added quietly, "You've been a friend when I needed one most." Victor was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with suppressed emotion. "You've been good company, Winnie. The cabin will seem too quiet once you're gone." It was as close to an admission of feelings as he had ever come. Winifred's heart quickened. "It doesn't have to be quiet," she said, scarcely believing her own boldness. "You could come with me." The words hung in the air between them, impossible to retract. Victor turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "To Fort Worth?" he asked finally. Winifred nodded, her courage faltering slightly under his steady gaze. "I know it's presumptuous of me to suggest it. You have your life here and we've known each other such a short time, but She took a deep breath. "I care for you, Victor, more than I should, perhaps." Victor's hand found hers in the darkness, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "Winnie," he said, her name almost a sigh. "I care for you too. God help me, I do, but I'm not fit company for someone like you." "Someone like me," Winifred repeated, confused. "Someone good. Untouched by the kind of darkness I've seen, created." His fingers tightened briefly around hers. "The things I did during the war, they follow me. It's why I came out here, why I stay away from people." Winifred turned to face him fully. "Do you think you're the only one with regrets? With pain in your past? We all carry burdens, Victor. The question is whether we carry them alone or together." For a heartbeat, she thought he would pull away. Instead, he raised his free hand to touch her face, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "You make me want things I'd given up hoping for," he said softly. "A different kind of life, a future with someone who sees past the scars." "Then let yourself want them," Winifred whispered. "Let yourself try." In answer, Victor leaned forward and kissed her, a tender meeting of lips that quickly deepened into something more urgent, more honest than words could express. Winifred responded with all the feelings she had been holding back, her arms winding around his neck as he pulled her closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unevenly, Victor pressed his forehead to hers. "If I come with you," he said, "it won't be easy." "I'm not an easy man to love, Winnie." "I don't want easy," she replied. "I want real, I want you." Victor's laugh was soft and wondering. "How is it that the most stubborn woman I've ever met is also the one I can't imagine living without?" "Perhaps you needed someone equally stubborn to match you," Winifred suggested, smiling against his lips as he kissed her again. They stayed on the porch until the eastern sky began to lighten, talking of practical matters, how Victor would settle his affairs in Prescott, what skills he could contribute to the ranch in Fort Worth, whether they should marry before or after arriving in Texas. "After," Winifred decided. "I want to be established on my own land first, so no one can say I needed a husband to claim my inheritance." Victor nodded, understanding her need to prove herself. "After it is, then. Though I warn you, Mrs. Holloway will have the whole town gossiping about us traveling together unwed." "Let them gossip," Winifred said with newfound confidence. "We know the truth of our intentions." As the sun rose over the Arizona desert, painting the landscape in shades of pink and gold, Winifred felt a sense of rightness settle over her. The accident that had seemed so disastrous had led her to this moment, to this man, to a future neither of them had anticipated but both now embraced. 3 days later, they boarded the stage-coach to Flagstaff, Thunder following behind on a lead rope. Victor had sold his trap lines and most of his possessions, keeping only those with sentimental value or practical use. The cabin he left in the care of a Yavapai friend who had occasionally traded with him, with the understanding that Victor might return someday, perhaps for a visit. The journey to Fort Worth was long and occasionally arduous, but Winifred found herself enjoying the adventure in a way she never had before. Victor's presence transformed what might have been a taxing ordeal into an exploration. His knowledge of the territories they passed through enhancing her appreciation of the changing landscapes. They arrived in Fort Worth on a warm spring day in 1876, the town bustling with activity as cattle drives prepared to head north to the railheads in Kansas. Winifred's uncle's solicitor, Mr. Jenkins, was surprised but adaptable, when she introduced Victor as her companion and future husband. "Your uncle would be pleased to see the property remain in family hands," he said as they signed the final papers transferring ownership to Winifred. "The ranch has good water and decent grazing should support a small herd nicely with proper management." The Circle F Ranch, as Winifred christened it in honor of her family name, was indeed promising 160 acres with a modest but sound house, a barn, and several outbuildings. The previous foreman had maintained the property adequately during the interim between her uncle's death and her arrival, though he had since taken a position with a larger spread to the north. "Needs work," was Victor's assessment as they rode the boundaries on their first day. "But good bones. We can make something of this, Winnie." And make something of it they did. Victor's experience living off the land translated surprisingly well to ranching operations. He hired 2 experienced cowboys to help with the livestock, but insisted on doing much of the work himself, learning the cattle business through direct experience rather than delegation. Winifred, for her part, proved to have a head for figures and a talent for negotiation that surprised the local Cattlemen's Association when she attended their meetings. Initially treated as a curiosity, the Eastern lady rancher, with her quiet, scarred companion, she gradually earned their respect through her intelligence and determination. They were married that autumn, in a simple ceremony attended by the handful of friends they had made in Fort Worth. Victor, clean-shaven and uncomfortably formal in a new suit, looked at Winifred with such naked adoration as they exchanged vows that several of the ladies present were moved to tears. "You are the bravest thing that ever happened to me," he whispered to her at the small reception afterward, the words meant for her ears alone. Life settled into a rhythm after that, challenging but deeply satisfying. The ranch prospered under their joint management, with Victor handling the physical operations while Winifred managed the business aspects and contributed her own labor where needed. They complemented each other's strengths and compensated for each other's weaknesses, forming a partnership that extended far beyond the bedroom. Not that their marriage lacked passion, quite the contrary. Victor, who had lived so long without tender human contact, proved to be a devoted and attentive husband, his natural reticence giving way to unexpected ardor in private. Winifred, freed from the constraints of proper Boston society, discovered her own capacity for desire and fulfillment in his arms. There were difficult moments, of course. Victor occasionally retreated into silence when memories of the war surfaced, usually triggered by thunderstorms that reminded him of artillery fire or the 4th of July celebrations that sounded too much like battle. On those days, Winifred gave him space but remained nearby, ready to reach across the darkness when he was able to accept her hand. In turn, he supported her through the criticism and occasional outright hostility she faced as a female ranch owner. When a prominent cattle buyer refused to negotiate with her, insisting on speaking only to the man in charge, Victor stepped back and let Winifred handle the situation her own way, his quiet confidence in her abilities worth more than any outspoken defense could have been. Their first child, a son they named James, was born in the summer of 1878, his arrival coinciding with a particularly profitable cattle sale that allowed them to expand their holdings. Victor, who had faced the prospect of fatherhood with a mixture of joy and terror, found himself unexpectedly adept at caring for an infant, his large hands gentle as he rocked his son to sleep. "Never thought I'd have this," he confessed to Winifred one night as they watched James sleeping in his cradle. "A family, a home that feels like one." Winifred leaned against his shoulder, content in a way she had never imagined possible when she'd first set out from Boston. "Nor did I," she admitted. "I thought independence meant being alone. I never realized it could mean choosing who to share your life with." Their family grew again 3 years later with the birth of their daughter, Elizabeth, a strong-willed child who inherited her mother's intelligence and her father's love of the outdoors. The children thrived in the freedom of ranch life, learning responsibility alongside adventure, their childhood a happy balance of work and play. As the years passed, the story of their meeting became family legend, retold on anniversaries and special occasions. The children never tired of hearing how their father had climbed down a cliff to rescue their mother, or how she had later persuaded him to follow her to Texas. "You make it sound so romantic," Victor would protest, though the smile in his eyes belied his gruff tone. "It was romantic," Winifred would insist, "the most romantic thing that ever happened to me." And in quiet moments, when the children were asleep and they had the porch to themselves, they would sometimes remember that narrow ledge and the twist of fate that had brought them together. If Daisy hadn't been spooked by that snake, Winifred mused one such evening, 20 years after the accident, her head resting on Victor's shoulder as they watched the Texas sunset. "If I hadn't decided to check my trap line early that day," Victor added, his arm secure around her waist. "Do you ever regret it?" Winifred asked, voicing a question she had never before dared to ask. "Leaving Arizona, coming here with me," Victor's answer was immediate and certain. "Never," he said, turning to look at her, his blue eyes as clear and honest as they had been when he first peered down at her from the cliff edge. "Best decision I ever made." Winifred smiled, seeing in his weathered face the same essential goodness that had drawn her to him all those years ago. "Mine too," she said softly. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, much like they had on that night when they'd first confessed their feelings, Victor and Winifred Mercer sat together in the comfortable silence of two people who had found in each other not just love, but home. In time, the Circle F became one of the most respected medium-sized ranches in the Fort Worth area, known for its well-managed herds and fair business practices. James eventually took over the main operations, with Elizabeth handling the books and expanding into horse breeding, a passion she had developed in her teens. Victor and Winifred, growing older but still active well into their 60s, watched with pride as their children, and later their grandchildren, continued the legacy they had built together, a legacy born from a chance encounter on a treacherous cliff, where a woman's determination and a man's courage had created the first chapter of a story neither could have written alone.